So today we are going to talk about a little bit of our macroalgae. So we've gone over our unicellular algae, which is our microalgae, but today we're going to be talking about macroalgae a little bit more. All right, so the most familiar type of marine algae is basically known as a seaweed. So whenever you think of a seaweed that you see washed up on the beach or that you see floating in the ocean, these are referred to as macroalgae. These are multicellular eukaryotic organisms. So these all belong to the kingdom Protista. Whenever you think seaweeds, a lot of times we think, oh, it's green, it goes through photosynthesis, it's a plant. Well, not exactly. So these all fall within that kingdom Protista. They are multicellular, they are eukaryotic, but they do have a more complex structure than some of our unicellular algae. An example of this would be something like a kelp forest, and we're going to look a little bit further into what a kelp forest is. This is one of our habitats. You saw that presented to your groups during the habitat presentations. So we know that these kelp forests are found in some of our cooler waters and are a phenomenal home to otters, Garibaldis. They provide excellent protection. All right, while we are going through this particular set of notes, what I want you to do is not only fill in your notes, but also fill in your seaweed diagram. So as we kind of go through, I'm going to walk you through the seaweed diagram and through the notes themselves. All right, so a little bit about seaweed anatomy, and this is the very first anatomical structure diagram that you are going to have to memorize. All right, so the thallus is referred to as the complete body of the seaweed. So on your seaweed diagram, this is your box with the bracket that encases the entire seaweed itself is the only box on the left-hand side. So go ahead and complete that as saying the thallus. The blades are basically the leaves of a seaweed. They are not technically a leaf because they do not have veins. So when you think about what a leaf looks like and you hold up one to the light, you can see the veins kind of running through it, whether it be a singular vein down the middle or multi-veins kind of spanning out from there. But the blades actually lack veins. And I do have a sample of seaweed to show you. It's actually a sample of kelp to kind of show you what exactly those blades look like. Blades can also be referred to as a frond. So this is your very first box on your right-hand side, if you'll go ahead and label that blade. All right, some of the big terms to go along with seaweeds is something called a nematocyst, and we will see the word nematocyst twice within our particular curricular content. So nematocysts with a P, so P nematocyst, are actually the air bladders that keep the plants floating up close to the surface. So if you think about it, a plant has to have these air bladders in water or else it's going to lay on the sea floor. Without these air bladders, it is not rising up to the surface and not getting the sunlight that it needs for photosynthesis to occur. Nematocyst is that second box on the right-hand side. So I've circled the little air bladders on your diagram, and I'm going to show you some pictures of what exactly those look like. The stipe is very much like a stem, and the stipe is actually your fourth box on the right-hand side. So there's a weird random box that doesn't have any lines drawn to it. You can cross out that box. So the second to last box on the right-hand side of your seaweed diagram is going to be labeled the stipe. So this is our support system for our seaweeds. And then a super important piece of your seaweed is something called a holdfast, and it's exactly the way that the name sounds. So it holds it fast to whatever surface. So seaweeds do not have roots. They do not gain their nutrients from the soil or from the ocean floor. Basically what they have is a root-like system that only serves as an anchor to anchor that seaweed to whatever substrate it is attached to. And this keeps the seaweed from going away with the currents. So the holdfast is your very last box on your right-hand side. All right, so one more time, kind of going over the structures. So our blades or our fronds are our leaf-like structures. Our air bladder is our float or nematocyst. The structural support system is the stipe of a seaweed. And then the anchorage to the bottom is the holdfast. All right, so looking at some inflated nematocysts, there are a couple different ways that they can look. They can either be kind of attached to the blades, to the fronds, and to the stipes. And they can be giant. So when we start talking about macroalgae, like some of our brown algae, we notice that our nematocysts have to be giant. So this is an average human-sized hand beside this basketball-sized nematocyst. So this thing is definitely going to keep that very large macroalgae kelp afloat. All right, so kind of going over some of the different types of multicellular algae. So all of these, there are three main types of macroalgae. There's green algae, brown algae, and red algae. So the very first is the green algae, and we find these in the phylum Chlorophyta. So if we think about this word and we break it down, it kind of sounds like the word chlorophyll. And that's because it has the pigment chlorophyll A in it. Only about 10% of our 7,000 known species of marine plants or marine algae are actually green algae. So it is very rare to actually have green algae. And we'll look a few more times at some of the other different types. So only about 10% of the 7,000 known species are marine algae. An example of this is sea lettuce. So the majority of our green algae that we find are freshwater organisms. And we find these in a lot of ponds, a lot of rivers, a lot of freshwater ecosystems, whereas sea lettuce and some of our other green algae marine species are only accounting for about 10%. All right, the second type is brown algae, and brown algae actually get their olive kind of brown color from the pigment fucoxanthin. And this is the majority of the brown algae or the majority of the macroalgae that you would find being on a beach. So fucoxanthin, we mentioned briefly when we started talking about biology and all the different types of photosynthetic pigments. And fucoxanthin is just that accessory pigment that gives it that olive brown color. All brown algae are marine, and we do find them in both temperate, which would be something like the coast of North Carolina, and polar coast, so a little bit more Arctic. These are the largest and most complex group of seaweeds within our macroalgae groups. A few different species that I do want to kind of go over. Padina is a particular type of brown algae that we can find off the coast of Hawaii and on the shores of Hawaii. It almost looks like bivalves or kind of somewhat like clams, but this is actual seaweed. So it is a species of brown algae. You can kind of see that olive green color from the fucoxanthin. Spiral rockweed, another one. We find these on the Atlantic coast of North America, so up and down the eastern coast. And we can kind of see these a little bit more in the Atlantic northeast, so a little bit higher north. All right, talking about some more brown algae. This is where we find our kelps. So we're going to watch a little clip of Jonathan Bird on kelp forest, and it's so interesting to see all the different types of creatures that live here. So kelp forests are actually found in both temperate and subpolar latitudes, and they are a super rich and productive habitat. So if you can imagine the amount of oxygen that is being put into the water from all these kelps and the amount of biodiversity and the amount of species that these particular regions can hold, it is phenomenal. All right, so laminaria is actually a species of kelp, and these are harvested for food in many different parts of the world. And speaking of food, we are going to kind of talk about why exactly we harvest algae and macroalgae at that, and I've got some seaweed for y'all to eat a little bit later. Macrocystis is actually the largest kelp and is measured at the maximum at 330 feet tall. So you can imagine the size of this particular kelp in the forest. And some of these kelps will actually see that they kind of lay across the ocean floor in more shallow areas. And a few of them actually will reach the entire span of the 330 feet tall. And these macrocystis algae can actually grow up to 50 centimeters in a day. So if you want to kind of imagine how big that is, the width of your pinky nail is about 1 centimeter. So imagine 50 of those in one single day. Kelp forests are home to these lovely little critters. So sea otters use the kelp forest to actually munch on the kelp. They do eat it. They also use it for protection from predators. So larger predators cannot actually maneuver around the kelp beds. And so these smaller fish and these sea otters actually use it as kind of a safe haven, a protection zone. All right, our last big type of macroalgae is something called red algae. And this is a more abundant algae, and we find this in a couple different areas. So we find this with the pigment phycobilins in it, and phycobilins are going to give it that kind of reddish pink color. We find these in shallow marine ecosystems. They do require lots and lots of light. So we find a lot of these actually in coral reefs. So coralline algae actually secrete calcium carbonate into the cell walls, and then they start to form a crust on rocks that actually help to contribute to our coral reefs. So I've got a few samples of that I can kind of pass around. It's kind of a reddish pink color on the outside of a coral. So this is kind of what coralline algae looks like. And coralline, not like the movie Coraline, but coralline algae. So a little bit of a pinkish reddish color. You can see the encrusting on the actual rock itself. And this is what's helping to contribute to this reef ecosystem. All right, so a little bit about the economic importance of seaweeds, and this is kind of getting onto the backside. So mariculture is a term that you do need to know. It will show up on your test, it will show up on your midterm and on your final, but mariculture is basically just the farming of seaweeds. So why exactly do we farm algae? Well, they have phycocolloids in them, which are actually gelatin-like chemicals that are harvested from the seaweeds. And there are a few different types of that, so I'll let you copy that super long word down. All right, here's some international algae farms, and I do like to show these because it is so interesting to see what exactly these organisms look like in the farming areas. So very much so like our terrestrial farms, these aquaculture farms and these mariculture farms are actually in rows growing this algae and growing this kelp in shallow waters so that the sunlight can get through. If you notice that the clarity of the water is absolutely phenomenal. You can see all the way down on both sides. So that seaweed has a phenomenal environment to grow and flourish in before it's harvested. And a really, really cool, I think, and I'm going to try to see if I can eventually see this, is something called the Kelstar. And the Kelstar is a kelp harvester that actually goes up and down the coast of San Diego, and it harvests the kelp from the kelp forest off that coast. And it is a huge barge, and basically what it does is it goes through and it kind of pulls up the holdfast of these kelps in order to be harvested. Now they are not over harvesting any of these, so they do this all in moderation, but it is used for a variety of different things. All right, so I'm gonna put all this information up here so you can kind of get it as I go through. All right, so some of our different gelatin-like substances that actually come from our seaweeds is something called algin. So this is coming from our macrocystis, our giant kelps, and it's used in dairy products, cheese, and toppings to actually keep them very smooth. We find these a lot out in California. So this is what our Kelstar is actually harvesting products for. Carrageenan is actually coming from red algae, and it's used in creams, whipped creams, and puddings to give it that kind of thick viscosity to it, but also give it that smoothness as well. And then agar, you may have heard of before. Most of you guys have actually used agar, whether you realized it or not, but it is a meat preservative. It's found in different types of jellies, and we actually use it in the Butler Biology Science Department when we do the bacteria-bound lab with our biology students. So if you've ever swabbed anything and put it on a petri dish in a science class, and I know that my students have done that, those bacterial plates were full of this agar, and it basically works as a bacteria food. All right, so here's where we get into some of the kind of crazy stuff. So seaweed is so important for all of the different areas around the world in terms of food. So these Pringles actually came out many, many years ago. I still try to find them. They are definitely regional. They are not something that would normally be found in the United States, but they do have seaweed-like Pringles. I have some seaweed chits for you today, and then some actual seaweed pieces as well. All right, real quickly, kind of going through our marine plants. So our kingdom plantae. So we do have plants that actually fall within the kingdom plantae. All right, so we find these a lot along shorelines and our intertidal zones. They do have a true root, stem, and leaf systems. Only seagrasses are the only truly marine plants. So they spend their entire lives completely submerged by the seawater, and they are rarely exposed at low tide. All right, mangroves, just kind of going through this real fast. Mangroves you kind of heard of when you did your habitat presentations. And basically these are a super important habitat because they flourish along these shores and protect all these shorelines from heavy surf. So when we start looking at the video cut out on me, so there's a little glitch in the system here as I kind of go back through some of our mangrove information. So mangrove forests are an extremely important habitat because they do protect shorelines from heavy surf. So they end up creating a kind of area of calm where the tides and the waves cannot actually impact any of our ocean organisms. What's really cool about mangroves is that they have actually adapted super thick leaves in order to prevent water loss. So all plants go through a process called transpiration, which is getting rid of that excess water from cellular respiration occurring. While mangroves, because they are in that salty environment and because we know that osmosis would draw that water out into that salty environment, they've actually adapted these super thick leaves with a very thick cuticle in order to prevent that loss of water, thus maintaining an osmotic balance. All right, so a lot of different species actually live in the mangrove forest. Lemon sharks are a beautiful creature. So they are kind of a yellowish, tan, sandy color shark. And they actually use the mangrove forest to give birth. And then those babies actually live within the root systems of the mangroves before they can be large enough to actually protect themselves. All right, the only truly marine plants, and this is the last little bit of Kingdom Plantae that I'm going to go over, are our seagrasses. For example, an eelgrass. So an eelgrass is the most common seagrass. We actually find these carpeting the bottom of the ocean, and they reduce the movement of waves and currents. So a lot of people actually drive over seagrass areas and don't even know that that is what they are looking at. So they pollinate through the water. They are completely submerged, and they basically carpet the entire ocean floor. But they provide this very calm habitat, much like the mangrove forest, in that they do, like I said, reduce the movement of the waves and the currents. So they actually kind of work as a buffer area. And then our last little bit are some of our salt marsh plants. And we can see these all over the Outer Banks, all up and down the coast of North, South, and Georgia. But we see a lot of these cord grasses. So cord grasses are salt-tolerant marine plants, which are only submerged completely at high tide. So a lot of times when you're driving over the bridges to get out to the beach areas, you'll drive over these salt marsh areas and you'll see people kayaking through, you'll see boats kind of moving through them as well. But these cord grasses are some of our salt marsh plants. They do have salt glands to them, so they actually help kind of work with maintaining that osmotic balance. We do find these a lot in our estuary ecosystems.